Panavia Tornado is one of the most impressive and effective aircraft of the modern era. It comes in bomber, fighter, maritime attack and reconnaissance versions. It's true to say that since the mid-1980s, Tornado has become the backbone of NATO's European air forces. And it looks set to continue that way well into the 21st century. The thinking behind the Panavia Tornado dates back to the early 1960s. Since the late 50s, the British Royal Air Force had provided the bulk of NATO's European deterrent bomber force in the shape of the three V-bomber types. But these aircraft had been built as high-altitude bombers. In 1960, after the shooting down of Gary Power's U-2 spy plane, new tactics had to be developed. The V-bombers found themselves operating under all the rigors of low-level flight. One by one, they began to suffer from structural fatigue brought on by the stresses of low flying. It soon became obvious that purpose-built low-level bombers were what was required. Two major Europe-wide decisions now had a profound effect on future military strategy. First, it was obvious that the European nations alone could never sustain a major war against the Soviet bloc. So most of Western Europe resorted to collective security, relying heavily on the American military presence. Second, most European countries decided not to increase their defence budgets. Britain, however, chose to go it alone. It designed and produced an advanced low-level nuclear strike aircraft which could respond to a Soviet advance across Central Europe. This aircraft, the TSR-2, would perhaps have been the most advanced bomber in the world, had it not been for a combination of aircraft industry bickering and spiralling costs. TSR-2 was a bold design created by the best brains in British aviation. Vickers Aviation, English Electric and the Bristol Aeroplane Company had merged to form the British Aircraft Corporation. And this collective newcomer to the scene set about producing a large shoulder-wing tactical strike reconnaissance aircraft, hence TSR, that could fly at high supersonic speeds and even reach Mach 1 at ultra-low level. In 1963, 30 TSR-2s were ordered at the unbelievably high cost for the time of £690 million. It was much more than any British defence programme had cost before. To make matters worse, virtually all of the rest of the British aircraft industry had merged to form a second major conglomerate called Hawker Siddeley. In 1965, in a gritty atmosphere of inter-company squabbling and rocketing costs, the new British Labour government cancelled the whole project. To fill the gap, the American General Dynamics F-111 swing wing bomber was ordered, and then that was cancelled as well. Finally, the RAF was given two aircraft as stopgap replacements, the American McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom fighter bomber and the British Blackburn Buccaneer. That had been purpose-built for the Royal Navy as a low-level strike bomber. The The cancellation of TSR-2 had a major effect on the British aircraft industry. Demonstrated clearly that Britain could not compete alone against the American aviation industry giants. In fact, it became obvious that no European nation could produce a major aviation project by itself. This realization spurred the European aircraft industry into cooperation and joint working. The development of an Anglo-French supersonic airliner was already well underway. It was one of the few projects that had survived those widespread cuts of the previous decade. It was joined by an Anglo-French fighter bomber design called Jaguar. The strength of the Jaguar concept was to prove itself many years later in the close support of ground forces involved in the Gulf War. So this was the background to the development of the multi-role combat aircraft, the MRCA, that would become Tornado. The early thinking that eventually led to the MRCA was actually about a replacement for the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. Britain was not involved at this stage because the Royal Air Force had never been equipped with F-104s. But these thought processes took an unexpected turn when the emphasis moved towards a requirement for bombing and reconnaissance. Now Britain began to take an interest. From the outset, the cost was supremely important. Two important design considerations meant that the aircraft would only need to be about half the weight and size of the TSR-2, so it would be substantially cheaper. The two differences were that the wings would have variable sweepback and the weapons would be carried externally. By the time the final requirements of the aircraft were drawn up, many of the original prospective partners had pulled out. The result was a tri-national concern called Panavia Aircraft. It was run by Britain, Germany and Italy. The main contractors were the British Aircraft Corporation, BAC, Messerschmitt Bölkow Blohm of Germany, MBB, and Air Italia. On the 14th of August 1974, the first of 9 MRCA prototypes flew in Germany. The first aircraft was then used to assess general handling and performance, and later prototypes went on to test all of the facets of an advanced modern strike aircraft. By the time Tornado GR1s entered service with the RAF in 1982, the aircraft had developed into the most advanced interdictor strike aircraft in production in Europe. It was truly multi-role. Tornado was intended to cover virtually anything that was asked of it, with the sole exception of dedicated air combat. It was expected to take on counter-air operations against airfields, interdiction over the battlefield, close air support, reconnaissance, and even maritime attack, and to do all of those things in all weathers. To fulfill all of those roles, Tornado has to remain undetected by flying at high speed and low level. It protects itself with a selection of self-defense aids, and it's capable of delivering a wide range of weapons. The speed comes from 2 Rolls-Royce RB199 turbofans. They give Tornado a maximum speed of Mach 2.2 in level flight above 36,000 feet, but they can also deliver supersonic speed at ultra-low level. To get under enemy radar, Tornado has automatic terrain-following radar. Low-level attack avionics allow it to press home attacks at night and in conditions that would ground many other combat aircraft. part of its defense capabilities, Tornado carries electronic countermeasure systems either in pods under the wings or internally. And perhaps most importantly for a multi-role aircraft, Tornado's variable geometry wings provide a high degree of strike effectiveness. For low-level flight at high speed, the wings are swept fully back. Mid-sweep works best when agility and maneuverability are required. Forward sweep is used for short takeoffs and landings. And with the wings fully forward and using the reverse thrust of the engines, Tornado needs less than 3,000 feet of landing run. That means it can land on short runways or even on stretches of road. It's also able to use parts of damaged airfields and dispersed bases. After a sortie, a Tornado can be turned around in about 40 minutes, even when targets are changed. They can actually change a complete engine within that time as well. Tornado has two cockpits. The pilot flying the aircraft and monitoring the systems sits at the front. The navigator is also the weapons systems operator, and he or she sits at the back. The navigator loads the mission data into the computer systems, and then, by operating the screens on either side of the radar, he or she has control over the mission route plan. During a mission, the navigator also controls all the air-to-ground weapons. Laser and radar ranging provide the accuracy that's needed for delivering weapons. That was amply demonstrated in 1984 when crews from 617 Squadron won the prestigious bombing and navigation competition that's run by the US Air Force. That kind of accuracy means that on operations, most attacks are successful in a single pass. A full 10 years before the arrival of the GR-1, the RAF had realised that its UK Air Defence Force was becoming obsolete. The mainstay in the fighter world was the English Electric Lightning, which relied on 1950s technology. The force had been bolstered by the arrival of the Phantom, but that too had its problems, mostly because the government had insisted that it should be re-engined with the Rolls-Royce Spey. It didn't prove as successful as they'd hoped. Many American fighters were considered and tested, but none was suitable for the specific needs of NATO's strategy. The requirement was for an aircraft that could carry medium-range air-to-air missiles. It should have a look-down, shoot-down radar system, and it should be capable of long-range combat air patrol. Tornado seemed to fit the bill, especially as it could be refueled in flight. So when the first production GR-1s were ordered, 3 prototypes of an air defence variant, the ADV, were commissioned at the same time. The basic design of the aircraft was the same, but there were different avionics and weapons. The Tornado F3 is part of a secure information system that provides data from a wide area supplied by airborne early warning aircraft. Like the GR-1, the F3 is armed with a 27mm Aden gun, but it also carries 2 types of air-to-air missiles. For medium-range attacks, there are 4 Skyflash missiles with classic AIM-9L sidewinders for short-range use. Although the aircraft were built by the same tri-national consortium as the bombers, only the RAF and subsequently the Royal Saudi Air Force ordered them. The next version of the Tornado is the GR-1A, the reconnaissance variant. Otherwise known as the ECR, for Electronic Combat and Reconnaissance, the GR-1A uses an emitter location system to detect and identify enemy radar. The ECR Tornadoes carry AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, and more recently, the advanced long-range anti-radiation missiles, HARM and ALARM for short. Both of them are dedicated to destroying enemy radars. Tornado was originally developed to counter the threat from the Soviet Union. The battlefield would have been the great central plains of Europe. where it was expected that Soviet tanks would roll across the frontier into West Germany. They'd have been supported by Soviet aircraft, and it was the mounting airfields for those aircraft that would have been amongst the Tornado targets. But in 1989, everything changed. The breakup of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism led to profound changes in NATO's defense policy. Almost overnight, the main enemy was seeking peace, and the whole basis for the West's thinking had become redundant. The British government sought to take advantage of the so-called peace dividend by drastically reducing its defence expenditure. Reductions were proposed that would cut the size of the RAF to its lowest level for 50 years. The plan, called Options for Change, was presented to Parliament on the 25th of July 1990. 1 week later, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces seemed poised to take over the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and thus strangle the West's oil supplies. As the United Nations passed resolutions condemning the act of aggression, British and American air bases prepared to rush reinforcements to Saudi Arabia and deter further Iraqi incursions. The priority was to send fighters and airborne early warning aircraft. On the 11th of August 1990, RAF Tornado F-3 fighters landed at Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. They immediately began flying combat air patrols along the Kuwait border. At that point, the coalition forces were vastly outnumbered by the Iraqi Air Force. That was equipped with highly capable Soviet-built MiG-29s, MiG-25s, and French Mirage F-1s. Over a period of 4.5 months, coalition forces in the Gulf were built up on a massive scale. The American code name for this reinforcement was Operation Desert Shield. The RAF's contribution was called Operation Granby. Tornado was the backbone of the RAF in the Gulf. The 18 F-3 fighters were soon joined by a formidable force of 62 GR-1 bombers. The Middle East was a vastly different operating environment from the Northern European theatre where so many RAF aircrew had trained to fight. However, their training had emphasised flexibility. They were ready for the tasks ahead. One thing that was still important for the Tornado crews was low-level training. But now, in a complete change from their former German environment, their speed and their noise were unrestricted. They flew at high subsonic speeds, hugging the sand dunes to stay below that lethal enemy radar coverage. These Tornado infrared camera shots show how extreme the conditions could be. In December 1990, the United Nations passed a resolution to liberate Kuwait. When Iraq failed to comply with the UN's demands, Operation Desert Shield became Desert Storm. At 1:30 on the morning of the 17th of January 1991, Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired from US warships in the Persian Gulf. They were followed by wave after wave of coalition bombers hitting radar stations and communications. Any Iraqi aircraft that resisted was shot down if it wasn't already fleeing from the battle. The RAF Tornadoes had a special task in this vast scenario. They were to fly in at ultra-low level and destroy Iraq's airfields with the runway-busting JP-233 bombs. These bombs had been specially designed to deliver many small munitions. Some concrete-penetrating bombs would crater the runways, and then mines would hamper repair operations. But this type of attack required the aircraft to fly directly over the target. Despite the intense darkness, the heavy flak and vicious attacks from surface-to-air missiles, most of the Tornado raids were successful. However, the scale of the anti-aircraft defences was such that 3 Tornadoes were shot down on 3 successive nights. Day 4 of the campaign brought a switch in tactics. Tornadoes went to medium-level attacks, flying at around 10,000 feet and using free-fall bombs against airfields and other targets. Playing a largely unsung combat support role, the RAF tanker force was essential to the British war effort. The tankers ensured that each combat aircraft went into action with a full fuel load, and crucially at precisely the time specified by their operational orders. Each heavily armed Tornado needed 2 refuelings on the way to its target and 1 on its way back. That meant that the tankers had to fly near or even in Iraqi airspace to wait for the returning Tornadoes. and having seen a number of aircraft go out and perhaps one less return, the tanker crews felt the loss of the Tornadoes just as keenly as the bomber crews themselves. One of the true success stories of the Gulf War was the use of precision-guided munitions, the so-called smart bombs. Back at home, viewers watching the air war on television were stunned by the accuracy with which these weapons could hit a target, apparently without any damage to the surrounding area. Some of the most enduring images of the war were those of laser-guided bombs going down ventilation shafts. RAF Tornadoes began to drop laser-guided bombs, LGBs for short, on the 2nd of February 1991, some 2 weeks into the campaign. LGBs detect the splash of laser light reflected off the target, that light coming originally from an airborne laser designator. Initially, the veteran Buccaneer provided this service for the Tornadoes. The Tornado-Buccaneer duo became deadly, hitting bridges and hardened air shelters and even Iraqi runways with unerring accuracy. 8 days later, the Tornado Force became operational with its own airborne laser designator, the GEC Marconi Tiled Pod, Thermal Imaging Airborne Laser Designator, that stands for. Once air superiority had been established, the plan called for air attacks on tactical targets to soften up the battlefield prior to the land campaign. RAF Jaguars attacked the Iraqi army in Kuwait. As fighter bombers in the Second World War had harried German forces, so the Jaguars blew up ammunition dumps and fuel stores, missile sites and tanks. At 0400 on the 24th of February, the coalition ground troops moved in. The land campaign was swift, around 100 hours. The Iraqi army surrendered. Kuwait had been liberated. Even today, years after the end of the war, controversy still rages about the direct low-level attacks on airfields. The RAF lost 6 Tornadoes, 3 of them in these attacks. The runway-busting bombs had proved effective, but it still seemed a high price to pay for success. The need for increased flexibility was one of the key lessons of the Gulf War for the RAF, and it would not be long before the lessons were put to good use. In 1993, the United Nations ordered the policing of the skies over Bosnia-Herzegovina, an independent state recreated out of the breakup of Yugoslavia, which had descended into civil war. As part of Operation Deny Flight, Tornado F-3s were sent to fly over Bosnia from their base in southern Italy, thus denying the Serbian aggressors the ability to launch their aircraft against Bosnian targets. But this time, there was no clear political directive about prosecuting a war. Ceasefires came and went, in frantic political efforts to end the conflict peacefully. It was all to no avail. By the summer of 1995, it was time for the UN to take direct action against the Serbs with Operation Deliberate Force. Serb gunnery positions and ammunition depots and communications installations were the targets for precision bombing. Once again, the laser-guided bombs showed their value in taking out key targets. More recently, the RAF and the Luftwaffe have received new versions of the Tornado. The GR-1B, a maritime attack aircraft, uses the German MBB Cormoran and the British Aerospace Sea Eagle anti-ship missiles. They're launched at standoff range and they then home onto the target with their built-in radar seekers. Finally, the RAF is expecting to receive the new GR-4 bomber version with its so-called midlife update to the original GR-1. It'll have GPS navigation, improved weapon systems including Paveway 3, that's the latest generation of US laser-guided bombs. There's also a new head-up display and a new under-nose forward-looking infrared system. The GR-4 will also be completely tiled capable, so it won't need other aircraft to provide laser designation. The penalty for all of this is that it loses its terrain-following radar. More than 900 Tornadoes have been built. They continue to provide NATO, the Royal Air Force, the Luftwaffe and the Italian Air Force with top-quality frontline aircraft. The recent changes will ensure that Tornado stays in service well into the 21st century as a proven combat aircraft in all of its many and varied roles.